Snow fell that night as if the sky itself had grown tired of holding its grief. It came down thick and unbroken, burying the Wild West beneath a white silence that swallowed roads, fences, and memories alike. The wind followed close behind, howling through empty streets and rattling loose shutters, as though warning any soul still awake that mercy had gone to sleep. Every sound felt distant, muted by cold, and the world seemed paused between one breath and the next, waiting to see who would endure. Somewhere within that frozen stillness, a woman walked alone, and with every step she wondered how much farther dignity could carry her before it finally gave way. Nokomi's Whitefall was 24, though the years sat heavier on her than they should have. Her shawl was thin, stiff with frost, and her boots were soaked through, each step sending a dull ache up her legs. Her breath broke into the dark in short, fragile clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. Snow clung to her hair and lashes, weighing her down like the past she could not outrun. Her parents had been gone since she was young, taken by sickness and time, leaving her to grow up in the care of a tribe that once felt like shelter but had slowly become something else. Loneliness had marked her, and some had learned to see that mark as permission. Kindness turned conditional. Safety became a debt. When pressure began to close around her honor, her freedom, and her life itself, leaving was no longer a choice made from courage, but from necessity. The cold chased her now, but it was not the worst thing behind her, and that knowledge pushed her forward even when her legs trembled. The lights of the town finally appeared through the falling snow, weak and flickering like distant stars. Nokomi slowed, heart pounding, unsure whether those lights promised warmth or humiliation. Each window she passed felt like an eye that might judge her, and each door like a test she might fail. Still, she reached the sheriff's office, its wooden walls dark and stern against the white night, and lifted her hand to knock. The sound seemed too small for the moment, barely audible beneath the wind, yet it carried all the hope she had left. Inside, the sheriff's office smelled of old wood and cold iron. Sheriff Harold Boone looked up at her with a tired frown, his expression already hardened by habit. Nokomi's kept her voice low, steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "Please," she said, hands clenched in her shawl, "just one night. I will leave in the morning. The night is very cold, and I cannot travel alone anymore." Her words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Boone refused her once, then again, his tone clipped and final, as though repetition might make cruelty feel like law. Outside, laughter drifted past from somewhere down the street, sharp and careless, and Nokomi's felt herself shrinking beneath it. At last, perhaps to quiet his own conscience, Boone gestured toward the porch. One night, on the wooden boards outside, nothing more. He warned her she must be gone by dawn and never be seen there again. Nokomi's thanked him anyway because gratitude had long been her shield, and curled up on the porch, pressing herself against the wall as if it might share some of its warmth. The boards were frozen, leaching heat from her body, and snow crept in through the cracks. She stared out into the dark, wondering how a town decided who deserved mercy and who could be left to the cold, and whether survival always required becoming invisible. Hoofbeats cut through the storm not long after, slow and deliberate, growing closer until a horse emerged from the white veil. The rider dismounted with practiced ease, snow clinging to his coat and shoulders. Elias Crow was 30, his face weathered by hard winters and harder silences, his eyes carrying the patience of a man who had learned to endure rather than demand. He had just returned from another town, leading a second horse behind him, when he noticed the shape huddled on the porch. For a moment he simply stood there, taking in the sight of her shaking form, barely human against the night. "You'll freeze if you stay here," he said quietly, his voice low and unadorned, as though he were stating a simple fact rather than offering a lifeline. "Come with me." Nokomi's looked up, fear flashing in her eyes sharper than the frost biting her skin. She shook her head, pulling her shawl tighter, asking why a stranger would take her anywhere. Elias did not reach for her. He did not hurry her. He only told her the truth, that men with drink in their blood and cruelty in their hearts passed through town at night, and that the porch was no place for someone alone. He waited, giving her the space to choose, and in that waiting there was a respect she had not felt in a long time. The cold made the decision for her. Nokomis stood, unsteady but resolute, and followed him through the snow. Elias led her beyond the town, away from judgment and lantern light, to a small cabin crouched beneath the weight of winter. Warmth glowed from its windows, soft and golden against the endless white, and for the first time that night Nokomis felt something loosen inside her chest. Inside, Elias gave her food, thick stew that steamed in the cold air, and dry clothes that smelled faintly of wood smoke. He gestured to the bed and took a blanket for the floor himself, lying down without complaint. As the fire crackled, Nokomis watched his face in the flickering light, amazed that someone could be so kind without asking anything in return, and wondered what kind of man gave shelter as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Morning came quietly, pale light spilling over the snow. Nokomis woke to the sound of Elias moving about the cabin, the smell of coffee and bread filling the air. He served her breakfast with a small nod, saying little, as if words might break the fragile peace between them. Later, when he left for work, she cleaned and cooked what she could, wanting to give something back, however small. That evening she placed a single feather in his hand, a token of thanks and trust. Elias smiled, a brief, genuine thing, and said nothing, and in that silence something began to grow. By firelight that night, coffee steaming between them, Nokomis told him her story. She spoke of her parents, of loss layered upon loss, of the ways loneliness had made her vulnerable to those who saw weakness as invitation. Her voice broke when she spoke of leaving, of choosing the unknown over a life that had become a threat. Elias listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his presence unwavering. When tears finally fell, he reached out and wiped them away with a trembling thumb, gentle as snowfall. "You didn't leave because you were weak," he said softly. "You left because you wanted to live." In that moment, her pain was not questioned or dismissed, and something inside her began to heal. The next day, a sound slipped from Nokomis before she could catch it, a small, startled laugh, soft as falling snow and just as rare. It rose from her chest without permission, the kind of laughter that comes only when fear loosens its grip for a moment. She pressed her hand to her mouth, almost ashamed of it, but the sound had already drifted beyond the cabin walls. A neighbor passing along the frozen path heard it and slowed, curiosity hardening into judgment, and by the time evening settled in, whispers had begun to move through town like smoke seeking something to stain. When Sheriff Boone summoned them, the warmth of the cabin felt suddenly fragile, as if it might shatter under the weight of his gaze. He spoke of rules and belonging, of how a girl like her did not fit within the narrow shape of their town. Nokomis stood silent beside Elias, her fingers curling into the edge of his coat, bracing herself for rejection she had learned to expect. Elias felt the slight tremor of her hand and stepped forward without raising his voice, refusing with a calm that came not from defiance, but from devotion. Boone's warning followed them out into the cold, sharp and final, a promise of consequences yet to come. The following day, the sheriff returned, his boots heavy on the snow as though each step carried the town's judgment with it. His ultimatum fell like a blade. If Elias wished to shelter her, he must leave the town behind. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Nokomis turned to Elias, eyes shining with unshed tears, ready to tell him she would go, ready to spare him if she could. But Elias did not look at the sheriff. He looked at her. In his gaze was no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that wrapped around her like warmth. "Then I will leave," he said simply, as if there had never been another choice, and in that instant Nokomis understood that love could be a shelter no one else had the right to take away. Elias did not argue. He did not raise his voice or curse the town that had turned its back on him. He simply packed what little he owned, folding his life into a few worn bundles with the same quiet care he had always given everything else. Nokomis watched him from the doorway, her chest aching with words she could not yet speak, the snow already beginning to erase the path they had walked together. Before nightfall, they left the town behind, its lights fading until they were nothing more than pale memories swallowed by the storm. They made camp beyond the town's reach, where the land opened into silence and the sky stretched wide and unforgiving. Snow drifted down around them, slow and relentless, settling on their shoulders like the weight of all that had been lost. As darkness deepened, Nokomi's strength finally gave way. She sank to her knees by the fire, tears spilling freely, her voice breaking as she whispered that none of this would have happened if she had never come, that his life had been torn from its place because of her. The cold seemed to press closer, as if listening, waiting. Elias knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, yet gentle as if afraid to startle her sorrow. He lifted her face with careful hands, his thumb brushing away her tears as though each one mattered. His voice did not waver, but it carried the truth of a man who had already chosen. "My heart belongs to you," he said softly, the words falling into the quiet night like a vow. "And tell me, how does a man live without his heart?" Nokomis broke then, all the fear and guilt dissolving as she clung to him, burying her face against his chest as if it were the only safe place left in the world. When he kissed her, it was not hurried or claimed. It was tender, trembling, and full of reverence, as though he were asking permission from her soul rather than her lips. Snow continued to fall around them, sealing the moment in silence, and in that kiss they made a promise neither of them needed to speak, that even if the world turned cold again, they would face it together, hearts unguarded, choosing love over fear. Dawn crept in slowly, pale and uncertain, as if even the morning feared what it might reveal. The snow lay undisturbed along the road, smooth and deceptive, and for a moment the world seemed almost peaceful. Then Nokomis saw the tracks, too many, too careless, and the stillness broke. Ahead, a small group of bandits had gathered, their voices sharp against the cold, and at the center of them stood a boy barely holding himself together. Thomas Boone was only 17, his hands bound, his face drained of color, fear written so plainly upon him that it ached to see. He looked nothing like the son of a sheriff in that moment, only like a child who had wandered too far and found the dark waiting. Elias did not hesitate, but neither did he rush forward blinded by anger. He and Nokomis exchanged a single look, a quiet understanding born of trust rather than words. She moved when he moved, her presence steadying him, her courage lending him strength. Together, they outthought rather than outmatched the men before them, using patience and resolve where violence would have only deepened the wound. When the boy was finally freed, Elias cut the ropes from Thomas's wrists with careful hands, as though afraid to frighten him further, and Nokomis wrapped her shawl around the shaking shoulders of a stranger who no longer felt like an enemy's son. When they brought Thomas back to town, the snow seemed to fall more gently, as if the land itself were listening. Sheriff Boone ran to his son, pulling him close with a desperation that stripped away every hard edge he had worn. His pride collapsed then, crumbling into something raw and human. He turned to Elias, his voice thick with regret, and offered an apology that trembled with everything he had failed to be. Elias listened, his face calm, and accepted it not as a victory, but as an ending to bitterness. "May you always be victorious," he said quietly, "not in fights or power, but in choosing what is right." And in that moment, beneath the falling snow, forgiveness became the truest kind of justice. That night, when the world had finally grown quiet, Elias and Nokomis sat side by side on the cabin porch, the snow drifting down in slow, gentle spirals, as if the sky itself were blessing their stillness. The fire inside cast a warm glow behind them, but neither felt the cold, for something steadier and deeper held them in place. Elias watched the way the snow caught in Nokomis's hair, the way her breath rose and fell, and in that fragile peace he understood that his life had already chosen her long before his words could catch up. "I want to build my world with you," he said at last, his voice low, carrying more truth than any vow spoken aloud. Not just a shelter from the cold, but a life where you never have to walk alone again. Will you marry me? Nokomis felt the weight of the question settle into her chest, not as fear, but as warmth spreading through places that had been cold for far too long. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak at first, and when she finally whispered yes, it sounded like a prayer answered. She pressed her forehead to his, their breaths mingling, and in that quiet touch lived every promise they would ever need. Morning came wrapped in white, the snow bright and clean, and the town gathered as if drawn by something larger than habit or rule. Even Sheriff Boone stood among them, his head bowed in humility, bearing witness to a union he had once tried to deny. The ceremony was simple but true, each word spoken with respect long overdue. When it was over, Elias took Nokomis' hands and smiled as though he were seeing the world for the first time. "Thank you for coming into my life," he said softly. Nokomis' voice trembled as she answered, "Thank you for loving me beyond fear, and for giving me a home where my heart can rest." They held each other then, beneath falling snow and watchful skies, as if the world, at last, had learned how to be gentle. And so, to you who are watching from the warmth of another time, remember this: that kindness offered in the cold can become a fire that lasts a lifetime. The world will test dignity, strip away comfort, and ask who deserves mercy, but love chosen in hardship has a way of teaching us all how to endure. Like snow, hardship may cover everything in sight, but beneath it, grace waits patiently, ready to be uncovered by those brave enough to keep walking.